one particular sub-ethnic group belonging to what you can say broader Korean ethnic community, the people who call themselves Koryo-Sara and who we sometimes as researchers refer to as Russophone Koreans. The reason for using exactly this label is that for majority of them Russian is their first language, and then it's very hard to pin it up to a particular territory or nationality, because among Russophone Koreans you have the people with Kazakh, Uzbek, Russian, Ukrainian, American, say German passports. Koryo-Sara Russophone Koreans are around 500,000 people. They mostly live in the former Soviet Union, but now, for example, we have a growing community of Koryo-Sara in South Korea. In South Korea, we are talking around 80,000 Koryo-Sara, and the number is growing. So, well, why is this important? One reason why those sub-ethnic communities like Koryo-Sara are important for Korean studies in general is because Koreans, compared to, say, Japanese, Chinese, or Vietnamese, is a very diasporic nation. That is, the proportion of Koreans who live in diaspora vis-a-vis the general number of Koreans as such is up to 10%. You have approximately 7 million ethnic Koreans living abroad. If you look into Korean Peninsula, you have there slightly above 70 to 73 million people. So around 10% of Koreans are living in diaspora. It's quite a lot compared to other people of East Asia. Here, for example, it's a map showing you where you can find overseas Chinese communities and of which size they are. How do you think? How many Huaqiao overseas Chinese do we have in the wider world? Anybody can suggest a figure? So it's around 7 million overseas Koreans. How about overseas Chinese? More. Absolutely more. I mean, approximately the figure. How many Huaqiao do we have? Everywhere from North America to Southeast Asia. That's a bit of Southeast Asia. They are rich and important. I mean, they have the richest communities there, but they are not necessarily hundreds of millions, no. 40 million approximately. 40 million, so, and if you compare it to number of Chinese in the PRC and Taiwan, so it's not 10%, it's much lower, as you understand, so it's around 3%. So, and the same goes for Vietnamese and Japanese. So, compared to other East Asian peoples, Koreans are very diasporic people. And, in a way, Russophone Koreans were among diaspora pioneers. I'm going to explain now that they were actually the first large group of Koreans who ventured abroad out of the Korean Peninsula in modern times. They were the first large group of ethnic Koreans to acquire and master foreign citizenship. And they were very active during the turbulent events of Eurasian 20th century, to put it this way. They were also instrumental in many of those decisive events that shaped Korean Peninsula's history in the late half of the 20th century. As I'm going to explain to you, they were among the architects of what we know today as North Korea. Lots of the people who laid the foundations of North Korean politics, society, culture, and language were Soviet Koreans. So, and it's also important to remember that in the Eurasian context, in the Soviet and post-Soviet context, it is not a very numerous community. We are talking about 500,000 people, as I have said. But compared to their numbers, this is a very influential community. For example, by the number of, in former Soviet Union, I wonder if you had it in Czechoslovakia, it was an honorary title given to the people who were supposedly the model workers, the hero of socialist labor. You might have had it. So, by the number of the heroes of socialist labor per 1,000 people, Soviet Koreans were number one. They had 206 heroes of socialist labor. And still, even when you talk to the young Koryo Saram, who no longer remember what sort of life their forefathers used to have in Soviet days, they still remember it. By the number of heroes of socialist labor, their national group was the first in the Soviet table of ranks. So we are talking about an influential ethnic group, and also about an ethnic group which is getting bigger in South Korea, and perhaps is going to migrate to South Korea in the future, getting larger, and representing an important minority in South Korean context. So here are the reasons why I chose Russophone Koreans for this lecture. So, the thing is that in case of South Korea, South Korea increasingly is becoming an immigrant society. Not to the same degree as the place where I live, in Oslo. It's around 1/3 of those people who live in Oslo are foreign origin. So it's an immigrant society at its height of its development. In South Korea, we have slightly below 5% people of foreign origins and their descendants living there. And very important, big part of this number are the people who are called co-ethnic return immigrants. Chinese and former Soviet Koreans who come back on special co-ethnic visas, which de facto allows them to stay. They have to renew those visas. But well, you can renew them until you die, basically. So you're not given citizenship. So it's not Israel, it's not Germany, you're not given citizenship on arrival, but you can more or less stay there as long as you want to stay. So if you look, for example, into the numbers of foreigners in Seoul, you understand that the return ethnic migrants from China make up more than 1/2 of all foreign population of this huge city. So as the time passes, South Korea is becoming more and more reliant on migrant workforce, and you perhaps can even guess why. Any educated guesses?
Aging society.
Aging society, and if you look, yes? Anybody wants to add something? Birth rates. I wonder what is birth rate here. I guess 1,2 or 3, which is usually in Europe.
Here,
yes.
Yeah, I think it's like 1.8 because we are like surprisingly good at having children.
1.8 is a great result. It's almost like a champion. It's a European context. It's enormously great result. I mean, compared to the country figures for Norway, we are just at the 1.4 level. And that looks very impressive. The thing is that South Korea impresses in a different way, because there we have, do you remember the birth rates for South Korea? 0.78, which is the lowest in the world. So if things go like this, so if we extrapolate the current tendencies of the future, population of South Korea is going to be halved in around 60 years. And if we don't want to die out like dinosaurs, we need migrants, and there are people who are supposed to be in a way invited to replenish the population of South Korea, are exactly ethnic return migrants who are considered more assimilable in very xenophobic paradigm of South Korean official. So among those ethnic return migrants now, it's mostly Korean Chinese who dominate, but Koryo Sara are also playing increasingly important role. And that explains why researchers are also growing in South Korean context. Okay, everything began in mid-19th century when China, along the dominant force on the Eurasian landmass, was getting exceptionally weak, by the standards of Eurasia's several millennia of history. It was basically an exception, and now we are returning to the normal with China in the center. Anyway, the great exception started. In the 19th century, China was becoming uncharacteristically weak, and the predators bordering on it, of course, used its weakness for their benefit. Russia was one of them, and it forced upon China what Chinese themselves call, despite their recent friendship with Putin, unequal treaty in the 1860 Beijing Treaty. And this treaty allowed Russia to secure the possession of what it afterwards called a maritime province. So that's how Russia came to be a neighbor of Korea. And immediately after that, the migration of Koreans over the newly built border with Russia onto the Russian territory started. So the migration, the documented migration, documented in Russian sources basically, is known from 1864. Most likely it started before that. It's also possible that actually there was some migration even before Russia came to that place. We don't have documents for that. So the reasons for the migration were quite obvious. China was exceptionally weak. Joseon dynasty was in a decline of its own in the end of the dynastic cycle. So lots of administrative capital was privatized, bureaucracy was in disarray. Then there was an amount of overpopulation vis-a-vis the resources. People needed new land. Well, in such cases, Europeans used to go to America, and Koreans couldn't do the same at that point, so they had maritime province. And it was easier to move on to largely unpopulated Russian territory at that point, because if they would have moved to northeastern China, earlier known as Manchuria, that would contravene Qing dynasty law. And in theory, they were liable to being beheaded for that. So, Korean movement to maritime province started actually before Koreans moved to Manchuria. The migration to Manchuria dates back to 1870s, while migration to maritime province dates back to 1860s. So, in this way, Russophone Koreans essentially are the first migrant group in modern Korean history. Well, it looks like a largely unpopulated territory with lots of fertile land in maritime province was something that attracted lots of Koreans amid the upheavals in the end of Joseon dynasty, Japanese colonization, epidemics, general social dislocations, disarray. It was seen as a sort of promising safe haven. So, Korean population in Russian Far East had been steadily growing from the 1860s and until the 1920s. By the early 1920s, we are talking about more than 100,000 ethnic Koreans in Russian Far East. And by the time when Stalin forcibly removed them to Central Asia in 1937, he had to remove around 200,000. So the population had been growing pretty quickly, and that despite quite bad sanitary conditions, epidemics, Russian civil war, and other disasters. So perhaps the population growth is partly explainable by constant movement of Koreans across the border, which shows that obviously maritime province at that point was seen as an attractive place. So, it was attractive from the viewpoint of migrants, and it was also attractive from the viewpoint of Russian administration. The thing is that it was a borderland without significant number of Slavic migrants by the end of 19th century. It was a very militarized borderland, because at that time Russia was an expanding empire, which was at that time making plans to take over Manchuria and perhaps even Korea. So Maritime Province was essentially a militarized, in a way, springboard for their future moves to northeastern China, or perhaps Korean Peninsula. Lots of military detachments had been stationed there, and somebody had to feed all those parasites. In a way, so Russia needed peasants there, somebody who would produce food, which otherwise had to be shipped via Africa, in a way. So since there was no railway at that point, and Koreans were supposed to be good in growing livestock, for example, Russian soldiers wanted to eat meat. So that's why Koreans were needed, and Russian authorities, they also tended to see them as unthreatening foreigners, unlike Chinese and Japanese. So the numbers were growing, and in 1894, Tsarist government even agreed to give Russian citizenship rights to all the Koreans who moved to Russian territory before 1884, when Russia and Korea established a diplomatic relationship. So around 13,000 Koreans en masse got Russian passports. Well, at that point, was it easy for a Korean to get, say, American passport? There were some cases, you know. Do you know who were among the first American citizens of Korean origin? Well, Soja Philip Jefferson, obviously, one of the great reformists of late Joseon period. There were some cases, but generally it was time when racism was official. In the United States, generally, if you were not white, getting citizenship wasn't necessarily an easy thing, unless you were born on the American mainland. So, in fact, we are talking about the first ever Korean community which got foreign citizenship en masse. Well, there were some interesting consequences of that. One consequence was that the people who got their Russian passports were liable to, if you have one country's passport, what is your main obligation? Do you pay taxes?
Military service?
Exactly. So you got several thousand Koreans who were potential conscripts. In due time, some of them were conscripted to the Russo-Japanese War and later First World War. And you remember what happened during the First World War. A large part of Russian troops were radicalized, and Koreans among them. So here we have an interesting thread leading us to how Koreans became a radicalized revolutionary minority. They were also entitled then to receive land grants from the state, which made some of them relatively well off, and those people were able to send their children to, say, Russian colleges, making them into bilingual intellectuals. Since they were minority intellectuals in the borderland, it was again easy to radicalize. And one more thing, leading to Korea's radical future in 20th century. Well, a Russian empire was trying to expand, but in reality it was a precipitous state, a colossus on the feet of clay, which was teetering over an abyss. In fact, it was very deep internally. So, as a result of the First World War, was that Russian Empire disintegrated, and then you had the most radical socialist group in the end getting power. Well, this group, Bolsheviks, was proclaiming itself proletarian revolutionary. The reality was that there were very few proletarians in Russia at that point, less than 3% of the population. Among Koreans, there were perhaps several thousands of workers, including mining. Workers, the majority was peasant. However, under such circumstances, for radical socialists, there was one indispensable ally. If you don't have enough proletarians, you need an ally in the person of
students and intelligentsia.
Intelligentsia, of course, and minorities. Because just like early industrial periods proletarians, minorities are mostly oppressed, socially frustrated, peripheralized, and have good reasons to recognize. So minorities became one of most important cultural rights, and it is true not only for Koreans, but also, for example, for several tens of thousands of Chinese who found themselves on Russian territory, Latvians, Jews obviously, and Koreans as well. Koreans were one of those revolutionary minorities. Around 4,000 to 5,000 Koreans were fighting in the guerrilla detachments in the Far East, and it helped, of course, that counter-revolutionary forces were being held by Japanese, so were exactly the colonizer. So, of course, here the general sympathy to revolutionary cause overlapped nicely with Koreans' own nationalistic fervor. So the result was that Koreans radicalized and generally were considered loyal, supportive minority for early Soviet power. Their radicalization was also important in the context of diaspora Korean activists being instrumental in building Communist Party underground in the Korea proper. So here you have several of those diaspora activists, second generation Russophone Koreans, who were bilingual, who radicalized quite early. In case of Nam Manchun, for example, Nam Manchun became a Marxist already after the Russia's first revolution was a part of underground social democratic circle. So they radicalized early, they were bilingual, they were able then to build up the edifice of Korean communism, also for Koreans in Korea proper. Well, one reason why it was easy for Koreans in the Far East to radicalize was that up to a certain point, their national desires somehow more or less fitted into what Soviet authorities wanted. Soviet authorities wanted to build up a Korean community close to Korea proper, which would show the attractiveness of the Soviet model of modernization to Koreans, inciting them in a way to choose this path towards modernity as soon as an opportunity arises. So Koreans were supposed to be modernized in a Soviet way, but via the medium of Korean language. All education for Koreans in the Far East was in Korean. There were around 400 schools. All teaching was in Korean. So some Koreans who studied at that point at those schools actually didn't speak Russian very well. So it was Leninist ethnic policy. In a way, supposedly very tolerant, we would call it multicultural. In today's language, there were 7 newspapers in Korean, 6 journals in Korean, there was a Korean theater, and even a Korean Jewish college. So it was a huge system of cultural and educational institutions which were supposed to translate revolutionary modernity into Korean language. So by some point, until some point, it all more or less coincided with what the Soviet authorities wanted. However, in the end of the 1930s, the ways of Stalinizing Soviet Russia and this national Bolshevism of Soviet Korean type parted with each other. As Soviet Russia was Stalinizing, the Leninist multicultural policy was being supplanted by de facto assimilation policy. Stalinists, unlike Leninists, didn't want the Soviet Union to be a confederation of leftist nationalisms, in a way put together by communist ideas. They wanted the Soviet Union to be a conventional nation state with one national language, the Russian language. So in the 1938, teaching in almost all Soviet schools was either switched to Russian or had to include large Russian language content into the program. So there was a general in a way, cracked down on leftist nationalisms of the minorities. And when we are talking about Stalinist repression, we should remember that everybody, of course, lost. I mean, there were losses all across the country. Ethnic Russians were victimized as well. But when it comes to leftist intelligentsia from minority areas, the losses were disproportionate. So, for example, very few Ukrainian writers survived the Great Purchase. Lots of Russian writers survived, very few Ukrainians survived. Ukrainian writers defined as those who wrote in Ukraine, and very few remained alive. And the same goes for Koreans as well. Practically all the generation Koreans, like those two gentlemen, they both were shot. Practically the whole Korean section of commentary was shot, in a way. So the likelihood for Korean revolutionaries in Moscow to survive the purges was zero. Practically all of them were killed off. In a way, and the Korean population in the Far East was deported to Central Asia. Well, deported to Central Asia. The people who had a chance to survive were younger generation Soviet Korean intellectuals who had no pedigree, no records of activity, and who were not seen as dangerous. So some of them were, after 1945, and Soviet Union took control over what later became North Korea. Around 400 to 500 of those younger Soviet Koreans were sent to Pyongyang to help to build there a country on Soviet model. What's interesting is that there was no one in this group who was older than 40. No one. All the South Korean socialist intellectuals were basically massacred. So the younger ones were still alive and they could be used. And what's interesting is that those younger ones who were sent to North Korea, they were the ones who received their education in Korea in 20s and 30s in the Far East. So, and they were accustomed to the use of Korean language in the revolutionary context. So they also were the people who often in the 20s and 30s had to solve the task, to fulfill the task of translating Russian revolutionary works into Korean language, translating socialist modernity. They were sent now to North Korea and they were doing the same thing there. So one of those people was Cho Gi-chon. Anybody have heard about him? Oh, Cho Gi-chon is one of the founding fathers of North Korean literature. So his grand poem, Path to Sun, well, it's basically a paean to the nation building in North Korea, to Kim Il-sung personally. Well, you find there are lots of traces of Soviet revolutionary romantic influences. He was a completely bilingual intellectual, completely fluent in those languages. So one of the products of this educational system that existed in Soviet Far East in the 20s and 30s. And people like him played an enormously important role in the make-up of North Korean language. So this language included important elements from Soviet Korean language of the 20s and 30s, as well as translations of terminology, for example, are concerned. Cho Gi-chon was one of the Soviet Koreans who played formative role in North Korean state building. Ki-seok-pok was yet another one. Nobody remembers him any longer, yes. But when you read, for example, Kim Il-sung's important speech from 1955, the first speech where Kim Il-sung mentions the word Juche. At that speech, Kim Il-sung criticizes Ki-seok-pok and Park Hyun-bin. Both were Soviet Koreans, and Ki-seok-pok was the editor-in-chief of Nodong Sinmun. And Park Hyun-bin was the director of the party. So Ki-seok-pok was in charge of printing party newspaper, and Park Hyun-bin was in charge of educating party scholars. So Soviet Koreans were in quite important positions. In North Korea was a Soviet Korean general who built up North Korean fleet. Soviet Korean pilots who flew north, who were building North Korean aviation, and Soviet Korean General Pyotr Chek, who was actually the first commander of North Korean tank forces. And so North Korea was largely built by Soviet Korean technicians. What was important from a viewpoint of cultural history in this process was, of course, this process of translating of Soviet terminology via those people with the use of the precedents from 20th century into North Korean language. He supposed life. I mean, it's strange that nobody wrote a novel about him, or maybe a biography. The thing is that he returned to Soviet Union, he survived. Some Soviet Koreans who didn't want to swear loyalty to Kim Il-sung actually perished, but he survived. He returned to Uzbekistan, and later he became a confidant of Rashidov, a Soviet nomenclatura boss, who was basically a sort of uncrowned king of Uzbekistan. So it's quite an interesting life. Strange that nobody wanted to write his biography. Even more interesting biography, and again, there is not a single academic article about him, which I don't know why, is Pang Hak-se. Before being sent to North Korea, Pang Hak-se was the chief prosecutor in Zilorda. Zilorda is one Kazakh city with relatively large Korean population. Pang Hak-se was sent to North Korea and became basically the chief of the secret political police. So he was the man responsible for North Korean purchase, basically for mass killing of Kim Il-sung's political opponents. Obviously, he had some experiences built on. So, and if you read through the diaries of Soviet ambassadors to North Korea in the 50s and 60s, you find out that Pang Hak-se was also a sort of informal mediator between Kim Il-sung and Soviet opponents. So the similar role was played by Namin. Namin, better known as Yakov Na, Soviet Korean again born in Far East. Yakov Na became Namin in the process of his transplantation to North Korea, was at some point North Korea, if anybody remembers who he was.
Number 2, yeah.
Foreign minister of North Korea. So he managed, I mean, it was enormous feat. He managed to be North Korean foreign minister having Soviet passport. He probably didn't have to talk about it. So, but he stayed for quite a long. It looks like, again, if you believe Soviet records, it looks like he also was a sort of informal channel of communication between Soviets and Kim Il-sung. In 1976, he just died in a car crash. It's very strange because there were so few cars in Moscow. You have really to make lots of reference to that. So several hundreds of Soviet Koreans were sent to Pyongyang to build a socialist modernity there. Otherwise, Koreans found themselves in Central Asia, initially mostly as peasants. They had mobility restrictions on them until Stalin died. After Stalin died, the restrictions were moved, and they could now move to the cities, which they started to do very quickly. So, by the end of the 1950s, Koreans in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan started to urbanize. The easiest way to urbanize under the Soviet mobility regime was to send your children to study at the university somewhere, back in Moscow anyway. So after you get the diploma, you get the right to live in the city. Because otherwise, you couldn't simply move to the city on your own. But there were channels which would allow you to do so legally. So, and since the most important of those channels was education, the urbanization of Soviet Koreans proceeded together with the improvement of their academic level. The two processes somehow coincided in a very interesting pattern. So, and by the end of the 1970s, the urbanization level of Soviet Koreans was already higher than for Soviet people in Europe. So already by the end of the 1970s, Soviet Koreans were largely an urban minority, increasingly an urban minority with white-collar jobs. For example, by the end of the 1980s, this process was even more pronounced because in Uzbekistan, almost 3% of all Koreans were researchers, not simply urbanites. So Soviet Koreans in Uzbekistan, as Jews were moving out of their country, were basically taking their place as a sort of highest educated minority there on the positions requiring a graduate degrees. So there was also increasing number of Soviet Koreans in administrative positions in the 70s and 80s. And interestingly enough, this process accelerated after the fall of the Soviet Union as more Koreans started to move into the position of cadres in the newly established regimes in Central Asia. So, the thing is that as Soviet Koreans were moving upwards in the pecking order, in the Soviet pecking order, several processes were coinciding. They were getting more educated, more urban, more white-collar. At the same time, in the urban white-collar environment, ethnicity was no longer such an important thing. You can compare, for example, with ethnic Koreans' mobility trajectory in the United States. They often start, the first generation starts as small entrepreneurs in Koreatowns. And that is pretty monolingual monastic environment around them. Second generation already gets education, university education, moves into white-collar jobs, and one thing that happens is ethnic mixing, mixed marriages. So, good example would be, for example, the family of one person whom you probably don't know, but most people born in Soviet Union in 70s and 80s remember him very well. Victor Tsoi, Victor Che, one of Soviet Union's most iconic writers. Anybody heard about him? Oh, yes, some people did. So, Victor Che was born in Leningrad. His father, Robert Che, was a typical example of how Soviet Koreans moved up. He was from Uzbekistan, but he got an education in Leningrad. He got red diploma, cum laude, which meant that he had right to get a job in Leningrad. So he got a job there with his diploma, married a Russian woman, and gave birth to Victor. So it's a typical example of how those processes of ethnic mixing, improvement of academic capital, urbanization, and movement to Central Russia were all coinciding. So, but one thing that happened in this process was also the loss of native language. Victor Tsoi had some sort of Korean identity. I guess he used to say that he felt himself at home. Places like Alma-Ata, in Korean interesting. So he didn't speak a word in Korean. And that became increasingly common by the end of the 1980s. Absolute majority of Soviet Koreans either didn't speak Korean at all or spoke in Korean. So the linguistic assimilation was proceeding apace. But of course, it wasn't simply a natural assimilation. One important part of the equation was the fact that the system of ethnic Korean language education that existed in Far East didn't exist in Central Asia. And you can't say it didn't exist, it wasn't allowed to exist. Because Soviet Korean intellectuals were asking the party many times to re-establish Korean schools, and the party never allowed it. So obviously, it was a policy. It was a policy since Koreans had two states outside of Soviet Union, unlike Uzbeks or Tajiks, for example. They were not allowed to build up their ethnic identity and were supposed to be assimilated, whether they wanted or not. Well, a similar thing happened with Soviet Jews, by the way, after Israel came into being. Their system of Yiddish education was basically destroyed. Last Yiddish schools outside of Birobidzhan disappeared by the early 1950s. and then the Soviet Jews were supposed to be worshipped. Anyway, so it wasn't simply a natural process. It was part of the policy, something we have to remember. So as a result, by the time Soviet Union was to disappear, Soviet Koreans were in many ways resembling Soviet Jews in that it was highly educated urban minority, with increasing number of people in administrative, research, and other white-collar positions. So, but even those Soviet Koreans who were not a part of this move towards the centers of Soviet Union geographically or towards a white colorization, even those Soviet Koreans were experiencing some sort of, well, status improvement. Since even if they remained peasants, lots of Korean kolkhozes, the collective farms, were actually very prosperous. Those collective farms were state-run organizations, but to a degree they were also entrepreneurial entities. They were allowed to keep some of their income. So, and Koreans proved themselves to be very good entrepreneurs, in fact, both in legal and illegal fields. So they were often honored by the visitations by Soviet luminaries. You remember who is this guy? Yes, of course. First man in the spaces. Gagarin's presence was symbolically important for uplifting the people's spirits. Gagarin comes to us. It's a bit like God coming to the earth. So, and here you find, you certainly remember this gentleman. You do. Oh, you don't remember. Well, yes, of course, was basically the boss. The Soviet Union's boss until 1964. Here you find him visiting a Korean kolkhoz, Palita Del, and marveling at the maize that Koreans were growing. Khrushchev had personal fetishizations of it. He liked maize. He thought that maize is a marvelous crop that can feed up the Soviet population. He probably was mistaken, but anyway. And he marveled at Soviet Koreans' ability to grow it. So Soviet Koreans were getting some prestigious visits from the center, and it indicated rather good standing of their collective farms. But aside from collective farming, they were doing something more insidious, called kobonji. It's an interesting word, by the way, kobon. Ko is a Chinese character which means basically it's a process, it's a rent. Kobon, bod is the same as the chabon capital. So kobon means paying your part and getting the rent proportionally. So kobonji was Soviet Korean illegal praxis of seasonal work. Usually kobonji meant that a Korean brigade would come to a Russian or Ukrainian kolkhoz, rent out a field for a season, grow some vegetables there, pay the rent to kolkhoz, sell the vegetables on open market, and pocket the profits. Well, it wasn't perfectly legal, but it wasn't completely legal either. So in Soviet Union, as long as you didn't employ anybody, as long as you were not supposed to profit from other people's labor directly, it wasn't necessarily punishable, but it was not something on the books either. So usually, if you could just bribe the local police, so, and kabanji implied that you worked extremely hard, but the vegetables market in late Soviet Union was a very profitable place. So the people who led kabanji became basically underground millionaires in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And until late 1980s, you had to be underground as a millionaire. But as soon as the Soviet Union embraced capitalism, those people became, obviously, capitalists. So, if you open Forbes rating for Kazakh millionaires today, you find out that you know what's the name of the richest man in Kazakhstan. Vladimir Kim. And you find lots of Korean names on the list of the 500 richest people in Kazakhstan. So Kabalji became the foundation for Soviet Koreans jump into the status of Soviet Union's entrepreneurial minority. And again, if you are interested in ethnic politics of Eurasia, you can make interesting comparisons here with Jews, Armenians, and some other minorities of Russophone Eurasia, equally entrepreneurial. So now, obviously, you no longer have to be underground to be a legal millionaire, and looks like the government likes it as well. So since now it's bureaucratic capitalist regime, the bureaucrats are supposed to rule over the capitalists, but the capitalists are still not being shot, they are being just controlled. You have the Korean business laws. So, by the way, you may know it's my cousin, Im Nam-soo. He's a professor of Korean at St. Petersburg State University. Involved also in Podrosaram ethnic politics. Well, the thing is that, and now we are coming slowly to the end of our story. Our story is going to end in today's South Korea. So, marketization was a process which in a way brought both advantages and some disadvantages to Soviet Korean population of the former USSR. Obvious advantage was that the people who already had been accumulating capital no longer had to hide the sight of the authorities. They could become legal millionaires. However, the underground capitalists were only a small part of Soviet Korean population, which mostly consisted of pretty ordinary researchers, skilled workers, and to much lesser degree peasants. Some of those people managed to prosper under the new conditions. Many migrated, so now you find Soviet Koreans everywhere in Berlin and Wien and New York and Los Angeles. But lots of them also got impoverished under the new conditions of semi-peripheral capitalism. So with state enterprises and academic institutions, especially in Uzbekistan, unlike Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan is much worse off in economic terms. So obviously lots of those people found themselves impoverished, and the result of that was out-migration in several directions. One direction of migration very obviously would be, the Russian centers, the Moscow and St. Petersburg. Korean population of Russia's biggest cities has been on steady growth since 1989. But if you want to, you no longer need the official, official authorization for your residential rights there. But the flats in both of those cities are notoriously expensive. So Koreans who move there are mostly better off. So if you don't belong to this part of Soviet Korean, post-Soviet Korean population which profited from the market transition, one place where you can go and earn money in order then to move to Moscow and St. Petersburg, if you still want to do so, is South Korea. It has something to do with the change in the regime of control over foreign labor in South Korea. The birth rates in South Korea has been falling steadily throughout 90s and the next decades, and at some point South Koreans were experimenting with different forms of labor migration. But in the end of the first decade of 21st century, they came to the understanding that South Korea needs a large assimilable population of labor migrants whom you can retain as a low-paid workforce indefinitely, rather than the people whom you exploit on a short-term basis. So that's how co-ethnic migrants from China and former Soviet Union were allowed to stay on renewable co-ethnic visas. And that meant that together with Chinese Koreans, post-Soviet Koreans now come to South Korea in very high numbers. So there were very few Koryo Saram in South Korea, say 2007. Couple of thousand, mostly people who married South Koreans, some students, some people with business visas and so on. But then the new system of co-ethnic visas was introduced and the numbers started to explode. And then there came the period after the 2014 when economical growth in Russia and much of post-Soviet Eurasia actually plateaued. So post-Soviet Koreans understood that their living standards improvement obviously needs some sort of migration. It's hard to improve your standards as long as you just stay there. And the numbers of migrants to South Korea started to grow very quickly. So now you have 80,000 Koryo Saram living in South Korea. And if you think that the total number of Koryo Saram for the whole world is around 500,000. So the 1/6 of Koryo Saram is in South Korea now. And I'm saying the co-ethnic migration, and you should remember that absolute majority of Koryo Saram came from Hankan province. And that's North Korea, not South Korea. So when they go to South Korea, you can't say that they go to the historical motherland. The historical motherland is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea now, but you can't go there the same way. So, but then, what happens to them once they come to South Korea? Obviously, it's much cheaper to rent a room in Ansan, or even in cheaper flat in Ansan or Volgokton area of Gwangju compared to Moscow, St. Petersburg. However, what kind of job can you realistically expect even this co-ethnic visa allowing you to work? I mean, what kind of job you can realistically expect in Ansan or Gwangju if you came from an underprivileged country where English is obviously not a widely spoken language, so you most likely don't speak Korean and have no network, even if you have, say, doctor's diploma or professorial position back there in Andijan, in Uzbekistan. Would you be able to find, say, medical or professional white-collar employment in South Korea? Probably not. So, in Gwangju, for example, I visited several times the place in Volgokton where post-Soviet Koreans lived together, more than 10,000 people, and a sort of ethnic ghetto. So where Russian, I think, is unofficially the sort of semi-official language. And I found out that a majority of the people there work in metallurgy, in, well, smaller plants, making various details for mechanisms, in the process called in Korean chumul, which translates as something like molding, right? So most people there, they work 10 to 12 hours a day. When they come back home, they're so tired that the best thing they can do, they watch Moscow TV mostly, obviously. So they watch news and then they go to sleep. Mostly they just have no energy left to learn any Korean language, but practically all of them know the word chumul and some other Korean words in a way concerning this metallurgical technology. So they mostly work at very small plants. Much of it is in metalworks. Other popular occupations would include, for example, dyeing factories. Yomsek Kongjang, that's where dyes, chemical dyes, are being used. And you should remember that working at metalworks or these chemical stuffs is not necessarily the safest thing you can do in your life. Accident rate is very high. So, and those people are not supposed to receive large compensations. They usually get some habigum. That is their compensation money, but it's not a lot. And then no pension. And Korean government is not going to pay for their medical services for them either. It has to be partly paid on oneself. Korean government pays for around 60 to 70%. So the thing is that the community has to take on their livelihood until they die, basically, because the accident rate is very high. So those people have to work, basically risking their life and health. And I was told that at some plants there, you have a doctor, a professor, a teacher from Uzbekistan all working together. So, all working together at the same line. And well, they prefer not to speak about their former lives because of course it just makes them pretty depressed, to put it this way. So it looks as if the adjustment in South Korea is extremely difficult. The majority has simply no time to learn Korean language and feel themselves maladjusted, out of place. There are no violent conflicts with the local population, and the local population benefits because the influx of migrants means that the rents for their properties go up. So there are some people who would rent their rooms and apartments. Economically, it's a good thing. So there is no violence between the locals and the migrants, but looks like the locals feel themselves threatened and feel largely both alienated and very condescending vis-a-vis the new migrants who mostly look Korean but don't speak Korean. So you sometimes have the situations when, for example, post-Soviet Koreans loudly speak in Russian on the streets, and if they stay there in the vicinity of Korean apartments for too long, sometimes the residents call the police, saying that there are some strange foreigners speaking strange language. Can be sorted out. So if you speak English loudly in South Korea, you will get the same effect, because people understand that. Sometimes English, even if they don't understand what you speak. Anyway. So it's a situation of forced coexistence, where both sides agree to coexist because of certain economical and social reasons, but neither side necessarily considers the situation ideal, and neither side also sees it as a long-term solution. It looks like, according to the result of my own talks with Uzbek and Kazakh Koreans whom I met in Gwangju, it looks like among the older people, the majority wants to survive, to be alive, to preserve their health, to earn some money, then return to Tashkent and Dijon, or Astana or Almaty, or perhaps even Moscow, and open there, for example, a small shop. So they mostly still part of the migration trajectory. Among the younger generation, it looks there is more interest in permanent settlement, which may be possible because the second generation post-Soviet Koreans have a special privileges when it comes to university entrance exams. In theory, they can get Korean diplomas and then enter South Korean middle class. And it looks like some of them are going to do so. And there are also South Korean civil society groups, for example, which want them to stay on and become a part of this polythra, increasingly multi-ethnic, multinational police of South Korean society. There are high hopes that those second-generation Konosaram, who become South Koreans while retaining their Russian proficiency, would act as a sort of a bridge between Eurasia, and specifically the refugee interest in Central Asia, in South Korea, and South Korean hub of advanced industrialists. In this case, they would in a way act as subaltern cultural entrepreneurs, if you wish, given their hierarchically different position between South Korea, a center of capital export, culture export, and education export, and say Uzbekistan, the country which imports education capital and many other things from South Korea. So if you go to Tashkent, for example, you find out there are branches of South Korean universities. Lots of Korean invested companies, Korean tourists, and the feeling that if you came from South Korea, you are the most distinguished guest. You are the guest, a guest of honor, in a way. So those second generation Koryo Saram who are bilingual and who consider themselves both Koryo Saram and South Koreans at the same time may become an important element of, in a way, bridging together the South Korea as a part of capitalist world system core, and Uzbekistan as a part of capitalist world system semi-peripheral. But of course, this sort of positioning, subalterns, bringing together core and semi-peripheral regions, this sort of positioning is rife with internal tensions and conflicts. Because you don't feel yourself completely equal to the core society to which you notionally belong. And you feel all sorts of conflicts vis-a-vis the society to which you originally used to belong before. So, well, perhaps one day in the future, we will get some interesting fiction, literature coming out from those second generation Koryo Saram living in South Korea, which will tell us about all the internal conflicts and contradictions immanent to their, in a way, conflict zone cross-border positioning between those two hierarchically different places. So perhaps we are going to get some interesting literature from them, given the fact that among Russophone writers, the Soviet Koreans are pretty prominent. You have lots of very good literature coming from Soviet and post-Soviet Korean community, and some of Korean written fictional works, you can even find them in Russian textbooks, in Russian literature textbooks. For example, Anatoly King's Father Forest. You find it in the textbooks, so obviously. Probably we will get some interesting literature dealing with those contradictions and tensions. Well, that's what I was going to talk about, but I think I already was getting a bit too talkative, so I guess I should stop here. And I wonder if you have any questions. Yes, you do.
I would like to ask about religion. So back in the Tsarist times, Koreans started migrating to the Far East. And I was just wondering if any significant number of the Korean community converted to Christianity or...
Oh, well, in Tsarist times, you see, Christianity was Tsarist Russia's official ideology, basically. You have to be, unless you already belong to another confession, usually you were supposed to be Orthodox in order to become fully Russian. In a way, so yes, Orthodox priests were doing missionary work in Korean villages, and lots of Koreans were getting baptized on the understanding that it will give them citizenship. So it wasn't necessarily religious enthusiasm. So you remember I showed you a portrait of Nam Manchun. Just a minute, I'll get that. Yeah. Nam Manchun, you see? His father was a Russo-Korean interpreter who was active on the Russian side during the Russo-Japanese War, but he left his family, obviously had another woman, so, and family was impoverished. And Nam wanted to go to a college, but he needed a college where he wouldn't have to pay for his education. And the only opportunity was Orthodox seminary. So Nam became an Orthodox student, just like Comrade Stalin in his young years, for the same reasons, by the way. So, and of course, since the majority of the students there came for the same reasons. They were in pequeños, they didn't have money, and they wanted to get education. This Orthodox seminary had a large social democratic underground. And they were getting Iskra, Lenin's newspaper from Western Europe, so it was a good opportunity to become a socialist revolutionary. So yes, obviously there were some interesting connections. There were also some Protestant missionaries coming to the Far East, but here it's anticipating in a way what is happening now in today's Russia. You have some Protestant communities basically being outlaws, like Jehovah's Witnesses, which is, by the way, I see as a major human rights violation. So, but something very similar was happening also before the revolution, because all America-related Protestant missionarizing was seen as a national security threat. So there were some Koreans who missionarized, in a way, on behalf of American Protestant societies, but Tsarist authorities were actually harsher on them than on socialist revolutionaries. So they were obviously foreign spies in this understanding of the authorities. And it's interesting how it, in a way, presages some of the issues we have now. Okay. Are there any other questions?
I have a question, two questions. That belong to the last part of your speech. And thank you very much for this lecture. How well are today Koreans informed about Korea's ceremony?
Oh, they are not informed.
Most of them don't buy no information in TV or not.
Very little. Sometimes it comes up in the news. For example, originally when the law about co-ethnic visas was first introduced around 15 years ago, the law stipulated that only those who can somehow prove their Korean ancestry in 3 generations, so only those could come to Korea and have those renewable co-ethnic visas. So the problem was what to do with the Soviet Koreans in 4th generation. So some of them went to schools in South Korea, didn't speak much Russian, and were completely acculturated. But they obviously were supposed to be sent back to Uzbekistan. So that became an issue. The issue was spoken about. You can find a KBS News archive. And in the end, the Korean government changed the regulation. So now, up to 4th generation is allowed to come for indefinite stay to South Korea. But otherwise, you only have it on the news if something happens. Like, for example, the remnant, the relics of Hong Bong-do, a great communist Korean militant leader, were returned to South Korea in the time of Moon Jae-in's liberal presidency. The whole thing was, of course, a bit farcical. Hong Bong-do was a communist guerrilla leader who was a Soviet Communist Party member. He was famous for having met Lenin, and Lenin even gave him a pistol. So obviously. So Hon remained a communist until the end of his life. So, and he was born near Pyongyang. So North Korea wanted his remnants back. But his grave was in Kazakhstan. And Kazakh government felt, obviously, the request from Seoul I did not get it. Because Seoul needs money, it needs investment. So in the end, despite the initially saying yes to North Korean requests, the Kazakh government overturned itself and gave the remnants of Hong Bong-do to South Korea amid loud protests from North Korea. So when they were brought to Seoul, you had lots of publicity around it. Of course, nobody mentioned that he met Lenin and even got a pistol. You had a question?
Yeah, I would like to ask 2 questions about the language. First of all, I would like to know if younger members of the community living in Korea who attend Korean schools still retain their Russian skills. And second of all, I'm curious as to if there's any possibility of those Koreans still living in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, etc. Are there any older Koreans who speak any kind of Korean? I think it's known as Koryo. Yeah. Is it possible to find anyone who still speaks it?
Very few. Beginning with the first language, I met some 4th generation post-Soviet Koreans who got the education from South Korean schools. Yes, they usually speak some Russian, but they wouldn't be able, for example, to attend Russian language school because they have problems with terminology. Their Russian is almost of family variety. So you see, it's not easy to be completely bilingual. In a way, so in the majority of the cases, it looks they just move into South Korean variety of Korean language, and they try to be as assimilated as possible, because obviously being, you see, Russian language is not a prestige language in South Korea, it's not English. So obviously having it wouldn't add to your prestige. It probably wouldn't add that many chances for good employment. So that has perhaps something to do with it. And when it comes to Koreomal, very old people, some very, very old people, the thing is that Koreomal is hardly understandable for South Koreans. It's a very different language. You know, in South Korea or even North Korean, you say, "Annyeong hasimnika" as a greeting. In Koreomal, it would be something unseen to do. So it's a very different language. It's based on Yukchin Panon, a northern Hamgyong dialect, which retains some features of the 14th, 15th century Gyeongsanto dialect, because lots of Gyeongsanto people were moved north. So to say, so it's a very different language. It includes also the words which don't exist in either of Korean languages, and the same goes for Koryo Saram's culture, including culinary. It includes, for example, some culinary delicacies which you don't find in either Korea. Like, for example, a mokopcha. Well, it's a like carrot salad, but you don't have those carrot salads in North Korea. So it's a very special culture.
And I think they also add a lot of coriander into their dishes, especially in Uzbekistan. That they add spices that are not found in Korea and only found in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan.
Yes, because when it comes to Korean cuisine, there is a Koryo Saram cuisine and set of Korean cuisine are very different things.
Yes.
Very different things, because when it comes to Koryo Saram cuisine, you have, for example, some variety of plov, basically being accepted as a Koryo dish. So it's very different. It's a very specific subculture in a way. And Koryomal, unfortunately, is dying out. In Soviet time, in the Writers' Union in both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, there were Korean sections. But both Korean sections of Uzbek and Kazakh Writers' Union altogether never had more than 20 people. So the number of practitioners of Koryomal writing was actually quite small, even then. Most of them just died out. Anyway, some of them were very interesting people, and I can lecture about them in many hours. Some of them were really good writers. Like Kang Hesu, for example, who started his career in the early 1930s and was an active writer until the end of the 1990s in Kazakhstan. Or Ugai Pekuk, and so on. So they were interesting writers, but then they just physically died away. So now you have some extremely interesting writers of Korean origin, but they mostly write in Russian. The patriarch of this milieu is Anatoly Kim, obviously. We have people like Mikhail Pak, for example. Some others who are acknowledged as very good writers. But again, they switched. They had to switch the language. Very few, by the way, write in Uzbek or Kazakh, although it looks like the level of Kazakh proficiency among Kazakh Koreans is getting better. But it looks like most of writing is still mostly in Russian.
Thank you very much.
I was wondering, returning to the repressions of the 30s, etc., were the Soviet Koreans ever students or employees at the Communist University of Toulouse of the East? Or
Lots of them. Lots of them.
Okay.
Lots of them, and practically none of them survived. The Communist University of the Oriental Toulouse had Korean department, and there were some interesting people who used to be teachers there. One of them was, for example, Kim Dan-ya, one of Korea's first communist revolutionaries. There were some other people. The head of the section was Choi Song-woo. Choi Song-woo is a person of, it's an enormously interesting personal history, a Soviet Korean, who was inside Comintern, was basically the person responsible for the Korean Congress, and he wrote the last known program of the underground Korean communists in the 1934. So all of them died. Not a single person survived.
Were they accused of, I'm sorry to interrupt, were they accused of Japanese espionage? Because that's kind of the key.
Yes, Ginta Yaslova, who also stayed in Moscow at that time, but she wasn't related to the business of Kutv, was Chu Sejuk. Chu Sejuk, who was before that a wife of Park Hon-yon, a Korean communist leader. Park Hon-yon survived because he was arrested in Shanghai by Japanese police in 1932. So he survived in Japanese colonial prison. Had he been in Moscow, he would have been killed. So Chu Sejuk was very lucky. She only got exiled to Kazakhstan, but she wasn't part of this Kutv war. So no, practically all of them were shot. Then when it comes to Korean students at Kutv, there were around 200 of them. And some graduates of Kutv were people of high importance in Korean history. Among the earlier graduates, you can find, for example, a person called Cho Bo-nam. Cho Bo-nam was one of the founders of the Korean Communist Party. He was at Kutv in 1920 to 1923, the very beginning. Cho Bo-nam became Social Democrat in South Korea after the liberation. It was the leader of Kim Bo-nam, the Social Democratic Party. He was a competitor to Syngman Rhee. And at the elections of 1956, he got more than 20% of the vote. So obviously Syngman Rhee didn't like people like that, so he was accused of being again a spy. This time, of course, not Japanese, but was Korean spy. And, yes, of course. And he was a communist before everybody knew it. So, and he was shot. So, but obviously, life is a radical in Korean 20th century. You always have to dance with that. Yes, says if you don't die in a violent way, it's very strange. So some of the people who graduated from Kutv actually played a very oversized role in Korean history, I would say. Very oversized role. You find lots of interesting names. For example, Ho Sung-hak, he was the head of this radical trade union, Chonpyeon, after the liberation in South Korea, and then he moved to North Korea. He was one of North Korea's first labor ministers. He was active as a part of North Korean establishment until the late 1950s and then disappeared. So no, there were lots of Koreans there. Actually, the number of Koreans at Kutv was higher than the number of Japanese. Are there any other questions? No more questions. Or maybe something general about Korean, say, modern history. No more questions. Okay, so then more or less done. So if there are no if there are no more questions. Okay. So, but then perhaps we are done. So, yeah.
I was actually very curious. Originally, we were talking about different topic of the lecture with Germany, and in the title you were talking about the influence of Korea Saram on the Soviet literature.
Oh.
So yeah, of course, that would be from those studying at the universities and such.
Yeah.
But would you say that there was a huge impact on the Soviet literature, or a big impact, or?
There was certain impact because, after all, the first Soviet Korean writer who became a member of the Soviet Union of Writers was actually Cho Myung-hee. So Cho Myung-hee was trying hard to syncretize his vision of revolutionary romanticism. In a way, before he became communist, he was actually an admirer of Rabindranath Tagore. So, and he was more of an anarchist, I think. So, but he tried to syncretize it with what he considered socialist realism, what he learned after moving to Soviet Union. He died a violent death, as you know. He was shot, but before he was shot, he trained a number of future Korean writers who then started an interesting literary milieu. Some of its members left very strong impact. The most important Soviet Korean writer in Soviet literary history is Anatoly Kim, obviously. Anatoly Kim has also an interesting personal history. He spent some of his formative days in Sakhalin, where Soviet Koreans from Central Asia were dispatched in order to Sovietize the local Koreans. Southern Sakhalin Koreans were, in a way, inherited by Soviet Union from Japanese colonial authorities. Japanese were allowed to move to Japan, but Koreans were retained forcibly. Actually, because Soviet Union needed a workforce there, so it didn't want to let them go. So, and then they had to be Sovietized, and the task was given to Central Asian Koreans with suitable party background. So, Anatoly Kim's father went to Sakhalin to Sovietize the local Koreans. Those Central Asian Koreans sent to Sakhalin to do the Sovietization work were, by the way, deeply hated by Sakhalin Koreans. They were basically enforcers of dictatorial power. They were deeply hated. So Anatoly Kim had some very interesting impressions from his Sakhalin days. Well, it's a sort of his well-established book was the Sakhalin stories. I would call it a sort of a Soviet-type colonial Orientalism, in a way. So the stories from a Soviet borderland, which were suitably exotic, but at the same time, he still identified himself partly with those wretched fates about whom he was going to write. He had a very complex identity. He was also feeling himself a bit closer to those basically colonized people about whom he was to write. So Sakhalin stories were received very well by critics community. Anatoly Kim entered the mainstream of the Moscow writing establishment, and in the 1970s it looks like he started learning Taoism, using mostly Russian language translations of Zhuangzi and Lao Tzu. Obviously, perhaps his East Asian identity somehow manifested itself in the process, and he moved into a new stilistical territory. He became an exponent of magical realism rather than social realism. So some of his later novels, like The Father Forest or Taramchi, Squirrel, they are written in the same style as Gabriel Garcia Marquez, fantastic realistic novels. And it perhaps would not startle you today, but you see, in Soviet early 1980s, when everything was supposed to be regulated and the way the stylistics of literature were among the most regulated things, you have a real Taoist writing in a fantastic style, mixing up fantasy and reality. That was a bit invigorating, interesting, new. He was very liked. He was very liked, and after Perestroika, some parts of his writings even entered Soviet textbooks. But that was almost before Soviet Union disappeared. So he became a popular personality, and he was even elected a deputy to the People's Deputy Soviet in the last Soviet years. He became a parliament. So he's still living in Moscow, I think, but he moved to Kazakhstan for some time. I think that he returned to Moscow. So his influence was pretty big, and then there were some other interesting fates among Soviet Korean writers. One of them was Ho Jin, also a person of completely fantastic biography. Ho Jin's grandfather was a Confucian scholar known as anti-Japanese guerrilla. So Ho Jin was born in northeastern China of Korean immigrant parents. He moved to North Korea and was North Korean officer during the Korean War. Then he was sent to Moscow to study cinema. And at VGIP, a Moscow Cinematic Institution, he became very friendly with Polish students there, some of whom were pretty non-orthodox. So, and then Stalin's so-called personality cult was supposed to be criticized. Ho Jin grew increasingly critical of Kim Il-sung and decided to stay in Soviet Union as a political refugee. So since it was pretty unsafe for him to be in Moscow, too many North Korean diplomats, they tried to kidnap him and almost killed him once. So he was moved to Central Asia and then returned to Moscow, where, interestingly enough, his day job was to teach Japanese to Soviet military intelligence personnel. So yes, an interesting occupation for a Korean nationalist. And his night job was to write what he considered the real history of North Korea. And since there were no chances to publish it in Russian in Moscow, he wrote it in Korean and then got it translated into Japanese, which was his second native language, and got it published in Tokyo. The book was quickly translated into Korean and republished in South Korea. He published it under a pseudonym, Im, which was the name of his family village in South Korea. So, and North Koreans protested to Soviet leadership, but Soviet leadership told them that they didn't know who he was. It somehow just died out. So, he was a very interesting personality and rather towering personality among Koreans in Moscow, but he also was an important person to turn to for the Soviet authorities if they needed advice on Korean and Japanese matters. So, yes, there were some interesting personalities there in the video. There were some others as well, those two are perhaps the most important ones. Ho Jin was also a poet, and he wrote poetry in classical Chinese, Korean, and Russian. Interesting.
Not Japanese,
He could have done it, I guess, but I don't know. I have at home, I have his collection of his sigils. So, it was an interesting personality, actually. So, yes. Okay, if there are no more questions, then perhaps we can call it a day. We are done.